Chris, what is our fifth main topic today?
Our fifth topic comes from Plot Twisties. Hey, gang. The Last of Us Episode 3. Wow. What a beautifully sad love story between these two guys. Nick Offerman and Murray Bartlett killed it. This show is killing it. Is the success of the show creatively simply due to having incredible source material to draw from and then expand on? Or because creator Neil Druckman is involved to shepherd the story along even with the changes they're making? I mean, Margaret Atwood was heavily involved with The Handmaid's Tale, and it's been amazing. Or is it a combination of both? Your thoughts?
All right, thanks a lot for saying that in. Look, let me deal with the second part of that question there first. We as fans have this habit. We all do it. I do it. You do it. We all do it. We're always looking for formula. What's the formula that did it? A lot of people think R rating in comic book movies is the formula to success. Well, we know that's not true. Some can, some don't. Is the Marvel formula, the way you're supposed to make these things? No, it worked for Marvel, won't necessarily work for others. But that's what we do. We look for formula. Why is The Last of Us so good? Is it because they have Neil Druckman in it? And there's been a lot of adapted material that has been fantastic without the original creators involved. And by the way, some adapted material with the creators involved that turned out to be total piles of dog dung. So I don't think that's there. It works because they just found listen, sometimes making great on-screen entertainment is about capturing lightning in a bottle. Get good people. They got Mazin in there. The guy who did Chernobyl, which is like one of maybe the best miniseries I've ever seen.
And he also has 25 years of industry experience behind him.
Yeah. And listen, you know who nobody's giving any credit to? But I'm sorry, it's because if this show was bad, we would be giving them blame. Sony Studios. I mean, listen, let's just call it. If this show was bad, everybody would be pointing fingers at Sony. And they would deserve some of that. This show is remarkable. You have to give some of the credit to their new studio division as well. It is what it is. I'm not saying lion's share. I'm just saying if we're going to point fingers of blame, which we would be doing, we also got to point fingers of credit. So let's move beyond the question of formula. I watched last night's episode of The Last of Us, and our buddy Tommy was over at our place watching football with a bunch of us. And as we were going into the theater room to watch Last of Us, he mentioned, I heard this is like the episode. I'm like, come on, really? Episode 3? I think we're just getting introduced to a couple characters here, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if it's going to be elegant. By the way, we're not going to go into heavy spoiler details here about last night's episode. We will be doing that a little bit later today at 3 p.m. as we do our Last of Us open spoiler discussion at 3 p.m. where we will talk in all open spoilery goodness and all the details of The Last of Us. Make sure you guys come back and join us again. Once again, that's at 3 p.m. Later today. That's 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All right, so let's get to last night's episode. I put on Twitter that I believe last night's episode of The Last of Us, which totally caught me by surprise, was a top 5 best episodes of television of the last 5, maybe 10 years. That was a motion picture. That episode of Last of Us last night was its own standalone motion picture.
It was long enough to qualify for being a feature film.
It was 75 minutes long, I think, without credits. I watched this thing. I was instantly in love with the characters. And we're not even talking about the Joel and Ellie stuff. I was immersed in this world. And by the way, I get this, I understand this. I read some criticisms, mostly everybody's lauding this as the greatest thing ever, but I read some criticisms like, it didn't really further the story of the show. I'm like, what are you, setting the world, understanding what's at stake, what people are striving for and what has been lost in this world, and understanding the context of the world itself and seeing these types of stories is every bit as important to furthering our understanding and narrative of the overall story as it is. Guess what? We will better understand Joel and Ellie and what they're fighting for and what they're going for because of this episode we just watched. This was Ron Swanson at his best. Nick Offerman in this thing. And what's the other actor's name again?
Murray Bartlett, I believe.
Murray.
From White Lotus.
I am telling you what, it's very rarely that I've seen a show or a movie that could get me so emotionally invested in 2 brand new characters so quickly. So quickly. this was an episode with humor. I mean, I'm sorry, without giving any context, so you don't know what I'm doing. There's a dinner scene, camera does a quick pan back, and he's sitting there with a gun in his hand on the table, and I just about died. I mean, it was so funny. To a final shot of a camera panning back of an open window, which is symbolically one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen shot in a television show. And again, if you haven't seen the episode yet, you have no idea what I'm talking about. No context, but a camera, simple pan backwards of an open window. And just thinking of that shot, I'm getting emotional. Just thinking of that shot is emotional to me.
Well, don't think about it. Hide your emotions, tamp it all down.
All that stuff. I was floored by this episode. And I'll tell you what else. To me, The Last of Us Episode 3 ends the discussion of, is the key to making a good video game adaptation staying 100% true to the video game?
No.
It's not. It's clearly not. What was last night was based totally on the spirit of the game, but was all completely original. Last night's episode was completely original from the game. What happened last night was not seen in the game. There's some stuff between Joel and Ellie, some dialogue completely taken from the game, all that kind of stuff. But the story of Bill and Frank, while these are characters, one we see in the game, one we don't really see in the game, but the story of Bill and Frank, for all intents and purposes, was a completely original thing that was really not a part of the game itself. The key to making a good video adaptation is not just sticking to the game. It's knowing when to stick to the game. Rob, you've said this. It's knowing when to stick to the game and when can you heighten it. Staying true to the spirit of the game, which they totally did. And I'll tell you what, this was the first time in a long time that in the same evening I watched an episode of something, walked away for a bit, came back, said, I got to watch that again. And I immediately put it back on again. I was moved by it. It built the world. I cannot wait to come back for episode 4. I'm still kind of shaking a little bit about this type of creative artistry that is also pop culturally entertaining is phenomenal. These little misdirects that were in it, which we'll go more into in the open spoiler discussion later. I'm telling you. Guys, we want to take a second to thank a sponsor of this video, Fume. Be smart. Don't start. Kick the habit. Put it out before it puts you out. All phrases we've heard 100 times, and yet we still continue to have bad habits. Today's sponsor, Fume, is on a mission to accelerate humanity's breakup from the bad habits that consume far too many of us. Fume is a natural diffusive device that uses plants and behavioral science to help you trade out your negative habit for a positive one. You see, Fume is not a vape. It's a non-electronic device designed to transform your negative habits. Because instead of pods filled with potentially harmful chemicals like a vape, Fume uses cores infused with plants like peppermint and cinnamon for delicious natural flavors. And Fume's new version 2 model is snappy and tactile. With an adjustable airflow dial and a magnetic end cap, your fingers will always have something to do. The device itself is really attractive, and once I popped in the core and took my first inhale of it, it tasted fantastic. Guys, the easiest way to stop a bad habit is to switch to a positive one, and Fume is designed to perfectly do just that. So head over to tryfume.com and use the promo code Campea to save 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. The Journey Pack comes with 3 unique flavors and the new version 2 Fume to help kickstart your positive habits. That's tryfume, tryfum.com, and use the code Campea to save an additional 10% off your order today. Rob, we as fans are sometimes accused of throwing around the term masterpiece a little too loosely, and maybe that's true. But with my whole heart, I'm going to call last night's episode of The Last of Us, episode 3, an absolute masterpiece of television. I think it raises the bar. I'm just floored by this episode. Anyway, Rob, what were your overall impressions of last night's episode 3 of The Last of Us?
Well, like you, I was kind of astonished by this episode. And, afterwards, I find it interesting, even though they're very short, to hear Druckman and Mazin talk about the fact that, and Druckman said, look, we could stick to the game. We could do the game and turn that into a series, and that would be fine. But he says, but if we can come up with ways to move away from the game that can add to we'll do it. He's not afraid of doing it. Now, what's really interesting, a video game, everyone is locked in. They want to have exactly what happened in the video game happen in a TV show, or happen in a story, which I think is odd because a narrative is different. The way a narrative is presented is different in a game than when it's in some other form, a movie or a TV series. What this episode did was not only was it a beautiful personal story, but it also encapsulates what the whole world lost. And it showed basically how civilization can both collapse and yet still be retained in the face of what's going on. It worked on so many different levels. And what it did was it actually added, you could play the game. Now, anybody that comes to the game now is going to remember this episode. And this episode is going to now accentuate the gameplay for people that come and play Last of Us because they're going to have this to remember. So what's really interesting, I think, about what's happening here is this series and the game are working together to create an experience that's greater than the sum of each of them. And I find that fascinating. And it would never have happened if Druckman wasn't working with Craig Mazin.
Anyway, Chris, I know you've been enjoying this series a lot. We haven't had a chance to talk about your thoughts on last night's episode, but your overall impressions of episode 3 of The Last of Us.
Oh, it's so good. I'm really glad that I didn't watch this with folks. I made my little mochi cake, brought that, hung out with some people, and then Logan and I watched this, just the two of us. And thank God, because I did not want to be social with anyone after this. I just wanted to hold my husband. This episode is beautiful. And the changes they made, to Rob's point here, they made changes that further this story, that further this narrative that they're telling. And by making these changes, a lot of it is still true to the game, honestly. There are things that are hinted at in the game, right? There are
some of it is things, expansions on things that are hinted in the game.
Yeah, and then they did take some big leaps with other things and different kinds of relationships and stuff. But what they did here is they made a really, really beautiful story that only heightens what we're going to see and what our characters need to know. Yeah. Right? They need certain through lines to push them forward in this current narrative. And it's just so expertly done. It's so beautifully shot. I really, really enjoyed this one. And it is really just fun to see Ron Swanson in a Ron was right about everything. I love it.
There's one other thing I wanted to say too, and this is a little thing, but anybody who has complaints about Bella Ramsey playing Ellie, her performance in this episode, it was a subtle thing, but they get in a vehicle. Her response, because her character
so good,
has never been in any, and as she's playing because I don't remember in the video game, I never felt this way, but her response to these elements of the real world that but the outside world that she's never been a part of, the way she's playing it, talking about forests she is killing this role. I mean, absolutely killing it. Her performance could not exist in a video game form because you wouldn't have that. You'd have to animate that. But she is crushing this. She's making the character of Ellie her own. And I have really been just loving watching her take on this. And she got to do a lot of really interesting things this episode, performance-wise. And man, I think she's just crushing it.
One other thing that, understandably, a lot of the conversation right now is revolving around this incredible story of Bill and Frank. But one of the other things, before we even got to that story, I've started to really appreciate this episode because while we're on episode 3 now, this was the first episode that they started the process of building the bond between Joel and Ellie. Because up until now, Ellie is a package, right? Ellie is a package that Joel needs to deliver, and it's cost him, right? To this episode, you start to see the dynamic between the characters, and we start to see the formation of a bond. And by the way, there is one scene, you guys, for those of you who've seen the show, you'll know what I'm talking about, where Ellie is near the beginning of the episode. Ellie is sitting down by a tree, and she says, I got to say something to you. She says something to Joel that he thinks she's going to say one thing. And she's like, oh, no. Deal with this. Basically, I'm not going to say what the dialogue was, but she says something to him that so firmly establishes her character. And I think it's the first moment, because you look at the reaction of Pedro Pascal's face when she says it to him, and you could see the formation of, I respect this girl. You know, a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Again, we won't go, none of that, but we'll get into that a little bit later today. But for so many reasons, this episode was like a new standard of quality in television. Anyway, guys, question is for you. Did you have a chance to watch episode 3 of The Last of Us last night? I am continued to be impressed every week. They just seem to topping themselves, going in new directions, showing this breadth of being able to tell incredible stories. What are you guys thinking of it? Maybe you don't think it's for you. Maybe it's not quite working for you. Maybe you think it's even better than we do. Whatever you guys think, jump down into the comment section below and let us know your thoughts.